In this episode of Beyond at Home, we're going to be talking about, well, one of the weirder parts of Christianity, the Holy Spirit. But before you click out, wait, because what I want to do in this episode is I want to try and unravel some of the weirdness around the Holy Spirit by answering one simple question. What is the Holy Spirit? Now, before we go any further, there are 40% of you who aren't subscribed to this channel. What are you doing? Subscribe, be part of the community so you stay up to date whenever we release content. And while you're subscribing, let me know in the comments, are you someone who likes scary movies or are you someone who steers clear of scary movies? If you are a scary movie person, let me know. What is your favorite scary movie? I'll be honest with you, I am someone who doesn't like scary movies. I don't know how, but somehow during high school on the school holidays when Blockbuster was still a thing and we had $2 Tuesdays and Gen Zers, you're going to have to Google what Blockbuster is. It was like what we had before Netflix was a thing. Somehow my friend and I watched Saw 1, 2, and 3. And I was trying to think about why do we keep watching these movies even though we were petrified of what was going on? And I think the reality is horror movies or ghost stories, they're one part interesting and lots of parts terrifying. And they're so interesting that you just kind of put up with the terrifying stuff. And I think, to be honest, the same is kind of true at times when it comes to the church. Because parts of the church can be one part interesting and a lot of parts terrifying. And I know at least for me growing up, one of the parts of church that was one part interesting and a lot of parts terrifying was the Holy Spirit. At least the way I kind of had it in my mind when people spoke about the Trinity, God being one being but three persons. The way I understood it was that God is the judging one. Now, obviously I know now that's not the case, but you remember I was young and this is kind of the way I thought of it. God is the judging one. Jesus is the loving one. He kind of gives everyone hugs and high fives. And to be honest, the Holy Spirit is the weird one. I'd see people getting emotional in church and I'd turn to someone and I'd say, hey, what's happening to that person? They'd say something like, well, that person's got touched by the Holy Spirit. My first thought is, I hope the Holy Spirit don't touch me. I don't want to cry. I don't want that weirdness in my life. Well, then they would do this thing that I don't think Christians mean to be weird when they do this, but it's unintentionally weird. They try to be comforting and they say, well, it's okay. The Holy Spirit is inside of you. And to me, I was like, things that live inside of you are not good for you. I think of tapeworm. I think of insecurity. In what world is something that lives inside of me a good thing? And I think that whether you're a Jesus follower or not, when it comes to the Holy Spirit, people are just kind of confused. I know at least for where I live in Australia, I've seen a growing rise in spirituality. People have these questions about spirituality. I've seen a rise in the number of people who want to talk about star signs. I've seen a rise in the number of people who partake in mindfulness or meditation practices. I've also seen a rise in the number of people who use crystals, which are actually a form of Tibetan Buddhism at one point. See, I think there's actually this yearning for spirituality. There's this question that people keep asking over and over again, is there purpose to life? Is there meaning to life? Is there something more beyond this life? And so I want to untangle a little bit of the weirdness that might surround the Holy Spirit, because I think the Holy Spirit is the one thing that can guide you to live a fulfilling life in an empty world. I need you to use your imagination for me. I need you to imagine that you are one of Jesus's first followers. And if you have no idea who Jesus' followers are or his disciples, there was a group of 12, his closest, that kind of followed him for 3.5 years. But I want to take you back to just before you began following Jesus. Let's go there now. Before you began following Jesus, you might have found yourself at a place like this because you're a fisherman. This wasn't your dream job though. Your dream job was to be someone's disciple. Because this was actually the dream job of every young boy in the first century. Rabbis were kind of like superstars or rock stars of the first century world. People wanted to be like them. People thought they were closer to God. But here's the problem for you. You'd missed the cut. You weren't considered good enough. No one asked you to be their disciple. And then one day you're just fishing by the lake as you normally do. And Jesus, and you'd kind of heard about Jesus walks up to you. And Jesus says the two words that you'd been dying to hear for so long. He says, follow me. And your initial reaction is to kind of look around and be like, are you talking to me? There's no one else around. and your heart starts to race, your heart starts to beat, and your light starts to get really, really bright. And so you begin the journey of following Jesus. And for 3 years, you follow Jesus. You see some incredible things. You get invited to every party that's around. You see Jesus turn water into wine. You see Jesus spit and kind of make a mud pie and heal a blind man. You see Jesus at one point in time feed 15 to 20,000 people on the side of a mountain. Then after he does that, Jesus kind of walks up to a mountain to pray, and you jump into a boat. And then a storm comes and you get really, really afraid. And then you see something walking across the water and you think to yourself, it's a ghost. And then you find out it's Jesus. Jesus gets in the boat and calms the storm. And when you were afraid a moment ago, now you're no longer afraid in the moment. And this is a pattern that repeats over and over again in the 3.5 years that you're with Jesus. You're assured when Jesus is with you, but you're afraid when he's away from you. In fact, so many times you'd be afraid, and one of the first things Jesus would say when he shows up again is, don't be afraid. And you think to yourself, well, of course I'm not afraid. You're here with me now. I've got nothing to be afraid of. But then one day Jesus is taken, falsely tried, and executed at the hands of the Roman Empire. And you are really afraid. You're afraid for your life because now the same empire that killed Jesus is coming for you. And Mary Magdalene tells you the tomb is empty. And you're confused. You don't know what to think. And Peter and John, they actually run to the tomb and they discover that it's empty. And you're still really, really confused and you're still hiding away. And as you're hiding, Jesus appears to you. And all of a sudden, you're not as afraid as you were anymore. And in that moment, when Jesus appears to you, your mind casts back to a meal that at the time you were having it, you wouldn't have realized it was the very last meal that you would have had with Jesus. But at this meal, Jesus said these words. He said, it is best for you that I go away, because if I don't, the advocate won't come. If I do go away, then I will send him to be with you. And your mind would have been racing at this point. You would have had a whole bunch of questions like, what could be better than Jesus by my side? Or maybe a better question is, who could be better than Jesus at your side? And if you were to ask Jesus, he would say the answer to that is the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is actually better by your side than me, which leads us to kind of the question that maybe you've been asking since the beginning of the video. What is the Holy Spirit? Now, I'll be honest and say that I'm not arrogant enough to think that I can explain everything about the Holy Spirit. I think there's got to be some element of faith to it, but I'll give it my best definition. I would say the Holy Spirit is a person. Often Christians refer to it as an it, but it's not an it, it's a person. The Holy Spirit is a person who relates to us personally. That's why Jesus, when he was referring to the Holy Spirit, called it the advocate or the counselor. And it's not just a person who relates to us personally, but it indwells us when we personally accept Jesus. And all that means is the Holy Spirit enters into our lives when we begin to place our trust and faith in Jesus. And it begins to make us new from the inside out. Now let's go back to our imaginary game just for a second. Jesus has come back and he gathers you on the side of a mountain. He's appeared to hundreds of people, but he gathers you on the side of a mountain. And he says, all right, now it's time for me to go. And you're like, well, what do you mean, Jesus? Like, you can't go. Jesus is like, no, I'm leaving. And he starts to ascend to heaven. He's like, oh, by the way, you need to go and tell people about me. And you're confused. You're afraid again because Jesus has gone. And you and the disciples, you're kind of hanging out. And the historian Luke tells us that at one moment, the house you were in began to shake and said everyone was filled with the Holy Spirit. And you felt courageous. You felt strong. But the problem was Jesus wasn't beside you. And in that moment, you began to realize something. You began to realize what Jesus had been trying to tell you all along, that the Holy Spirit inside of you is better than Jesus beside you. Because Jesus can only be beside one of you at a time. But what you're feeling now, it's like Jesus was beside you, but he's not. And you realize that that's the work of the Holy Spirit, making you new from the inside out. Now, this happened 2,000 years ago, but it's been happening for the last 2,000 years. The Holy Spirit's been making people's lives new. So let me ask you a question. How bright is the light in your life? Now, I don't mean like When you get yourself all dressed up, when you go to work, when you go out with friends, and you put on that face that, hey, everything is okay. I mean, how bright is your light really? First thing when you wake up in the morning, when you're lying awake before you go to sleep at night, how fulfilled do you really feel? And I've got 2 questions for you to ask this week. One of you, if you're new to the whole Jesus thing, and one if you've kind of been following Jesus a while. The question I have for you if you're new to the whole faith thing is, what if the Holy Spirit is the difference you've been searching for? What if the things that you've been searching for, the morning routines, the affirmations, the crystals, the meditation, what if you just keep doing that over and over again and there's still a little gap? What if the thing you've really been searching for is the Holy Spirit? And for those of you who are Jesus followers, what if you have what you already want, you just don't realize it? And what I mean by that is, what if there's a little bit of a disconnect in your faith life? And the reason that there's a disconnect is not because you don't have what you already want, but because you're not aware of it. I guarantee that when you begin to become aware of the Holy Spirit in your life, you begin to pray differently. You begin to love differently. You begin to serve and you begin to give differently. And you begin to walk in step with the Spirit. Because here's something that you might not have considered, that the same Holy Spirit that raised Jesus from the dead is alive in you and wants to bring newness to your life. I think that's probably enough for this episode. We're going to pick up the conversation next time on Beyond at Home.